The more you work with materials, the more often you're going to want to do something like a preliminary render of your project. And there are two kinds of ways to render your project. One is called OpenGL, which happens instantaneously, and the other is Ray Tracer, which happens only if you press the render button. I want to explain both things in this lesson. To follow along, go to Working Files, open up the Photoshop projects, then open up Render down here. All we have here is a sphere on a checkerboard set up as a ground plane. I put the two things together in one layer so that they could interact. I want to change the materials for the sphere and talk about rendering. So I'm going to click on the sphere with the selection tool once and twice. That opens up its materials there. Now I want to change the preset to something else. So I'm going to choose from one of these 12 because all these guys will appear instantly. They require no additional rendering from the ray tracer. So I'll select, let's say, these bricks here. They show up right away. No rendering needed. That's because the rendering is being done with the OpenGL renderer. OpenGL is a graphics standard, and virtually all computers these days have OpenGL built into their graphics processing unit. So most people with Photoshop can work in 3D because you do need OpenGL to work with 3D. And there we have it. It immediately rendered this thing in a 3D-like appearance, which is what you want to have happen. And I can manipulate it, click on it like that, rotate it around. And the OpenGL renderer is doing this work right now. It's letting me see this thing appear in 3D, and it's doing all this drawing so that I can see it, which is great. But if I want to reduce the opacity or give it some reflectivity or give it an illumination, the OpenGL graphics processor cannot handle that on the fly. That's when you need to use the ray tracer renderer. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to change this thing and give it some transparency. So I'm going to go back and click on it. I'll go over here and select some other kind of preset that has some reflectivity already. We'll go down here and select this one here. That's the metal steel. There you go. Let's close this down and take a look at it. It's got a little bit of reflection, not much, and it's 100% opaque. Let's increase the reflection a little bit. Over here, let's say to about 50%. When I do this, what the heck? It should be reflecting that checkerboard, but it's not. That's because I need to render this using the ray tracer renderer. Now, the ray tracer renderer is down here. That's this little button there, where I can right-click anywhere here, and it shows up down here in this little dialog box. Or I can go up to the 3D menu, click there, and go down to render here. And obviously, the easiest ways to do it are clicking on this guy here, or right-clicking out here and clicking on that. When I click on this, you're going to get this little collection of squares running across the screen. And that's the ray trace renderer at work. You notice that suddenly now the reflection starts showing up. With each pass, it gets a little bit better looking. It starts off looking pretty noisy, and then after about 5 passes or so, it starts looking pretty good, but it also starts slowing way, way down. If you look at the time remaining down here at the bottom, it says 100%. It takes a long time before that 100% drops to something like 99%. And if I let this thing finish its rendering job, it might take many hours for it to do that. So at some point, I had to say, okay, enough already. Nice job. This is good enough. I can see basically how it's going to look when I'm done. And so I stopped the render by just clicking anywhere in the scene. And that's how you use the ray tracer renderer. You just let it go a few passes and then stop it. Let's see what happens if I add some transparency to this. So I'm going to click on it again and click on it again to get the material selected. I'm going to reduce the opacity. So we'll take it down to something like, 50%, like that. And notice it does look transparent, but it doesn't look that nice. The shadow looks pretty bad. It's basically a draft presentation of how it's going to look when you actually do the rendering. So I want to render it again, but this time I don't want to render the entire scene. I want to render only this area. And you can do that with a selection tool. I like to use the rectangular marquee because it basically matches the shape of the renderer. So I've got the selection tool selected there. I'm going to select this area here. And now I'm going to click on this button to run the renderer, and it'll stay inside that box, which certainly saves a lot of time. I'm going to go by it a few times here, and you might notice a little anomaly happening here. What's this stuff on the bottom? Why do I see the Photoshop checkerboard showing transparency? It doesn't make any sense. I got this checkerboard down here, that's fine, but this guy is obviously not this checkerboard below here. It's this stuff out here. It's showing some transparency inside this ball that's not what you would expect to see. You'd expect to see the transparency showing through to the checkerboard here. What's happening is that this ball has some refraction to it. It's bending the light. So it's behaving the way it should. It's bending the light so you see out here instead of only on the checkerboard. I'm going to bend it some more here, make it really, really bend like this. Notice nothing happens yet until we render it, so click on this guy to render it. It stays inside the selected area there. And now it's really going to have a big chunk here showing the transparency off there in the distance. This is not a bug. This is the way it's supposed to happen, and I'm going to explain how you can deal with this in upcoming lessons when I talk about transparency. But just be aware this will happen if you have this kind of transparency and your background does not extend too far off into the distance. All right, now I want to talk about adding illumination to this thing. So I'm going to get rid of the transparency here by just changing a few things, going up to another preset here. And let's have this thing be, gold like that. There we go. Close this thing down. Now it's gold, but I want to give it an illumination. I want to have it glow from within. So I'm going to click on this little swatch here and change that to blue, let's say. So it's obviously different. And notice now we're seeing the glow coming out of it already. That's good. But we don't see a glow falling on this table. It should fall on the table. Since this is like a light bulb here, it should be some purplish glow falling on the table, but it's not. That's because when you add illumination, the object will become illuminated, but not the surface that it's on. So we need to run the renderer again here. Here we go. Let's see what happens here. See if we get a little glow on the table. There you go. And the purple is now showing up on the table there. That's what we wanted to see. Good. So if you want to see illumination, you need to render as well. So when you're done with your project, as opposed to doing this preliminary work, you want to do a full render, and you want to make sure you do a high quality render where it renders completely. And you might notice sometimes if you let it render till it's done, that it doesn't look that great, and you may wonder why that is. It's probably because the quality setting for the render is set to something other than 10. Let me show you how you find that. You go to Edit Preferences, or on a Mac, you go to Photoshop Preferences down here like this. The Preferences, go to 3D. And here's this ray tracer high quality threshold. Now mine's set to 10, which is the highest value you can have. That means that if I run this thing when I'm done, I want it to be a complete render. I just walk away, let it render overnight, and when I get up the next morning, it should be done, and it'll look great if you have a high quality threshold of 10. But if by some odd chance you have this thing down to something less than that, let's say 3, for example, then it won't look that good. It'll look okay, but not as good as it would if it were at 10. So I'll click OK here now and set it to 3. And now I'm going to render this. So I'm going to move the camera a little bit first, sort of undo our work. Because anytime you make a camera move change or any other kind of change, then the rendering you've done is gone. The ray trace render needs to start over again. So now we've got that selected. I'm going to go click on the render again, and let's watch what happens. You'll notice it does about 4 or 5 passes there, and it slows down. I'm watching the time remaining here. It says 100%. But at some point, it's just going to jump and say, we're done. No need to fast forward. It did about 6 passes. And it's done, and you notice it's not great. It's kind of rough around the edges, kind of noisy. That's because the quality setting was set to 3. So make sure that when you want to do a final render, you set your renderer back to 10, at least if you want to get the full quality. You set it to whatever quality you want, but 10 is obviously the one that you want to set to if you want to get a really pristine job. And there's no reason to set it to anything less than 10 when you're working on a project like this, because you can always stop it simply by clicking anywhere here in the screen. It'll stop the renderer as it's moving along. So there you go. This is the basic overview of the renderer. If you work with things that don't have transparency, don't have reflections, don't have illumination, then you really don't need to use the ray trace renderer that much. You might use it to touch up some shadows here and there, but other than that, you probably don't need to use it. But if you do start throwing in transparency or reflectivity or illumination, then you want to do these preliminary passes with the ray tracer renderer just to see how things are going as you work along on your project.